My name is Peter Owen-Jones. I'm a priest and I live in southern England. And this is a story about a wizard who has a very big idea. Abraxus Hex was tired. He was tired of being feared and never quite being trusted. He could feel it. He felt a lot. He spent too much time pacing up and down the long marble hallway, his coat of raven's feathers shuddering along the floor behind him. Really, he spent too much time making plans, but as the years passed, fewer and fewer of these really ever came to anything. Recently, he had found himself needing nothing, and from this nothing came a void within him, that place inside where the wind never blows, nothing ever shifts. Everything begins to taste the same, sound the same. Here, even the glamour of beauty couldn't hold him any longer. It seemed not to be able to hold him at all. Abraxus was a tall man with tight, gaunt features, his face pitted, and he had the darkest blue eyes that anyone had ever seen. He didn't so much look unhealthy, he just needed some sunshine. And there was no shortage of sun on Ultima. It was rare to see the clouds between April and October. There was the occasional storm, but what little rain fell did so in winter, when sometimes there were just weeks of flat white sky. After pacing up and down for another morning, Abraxus found himself in an unusually anxious state, so he decided to sit on the balcony for a while. If it wasn't for his habit of never looking up, of never raising his head, some people might have even considered him handsome. Really, he was quite young for a wizard. He was only 263 years old. He was making more plans, calculating outcomes, imagining doorways. But this morning, they were very different. Usually, he experimented with states of being, what it felt like to be a frog, what it felt like to be a kitten, what it felt like to endlessly fall through the air, the feeling of the swarm, what it was to experience the thirst of the desert, the exhilaration of hunger, the energy of ants. His favourite state was to become a tadpole, held in suspension, slipping effortlessly between the light and the shadow. And here he experienced rare moments of forgetting. It was one of the few states utterly without anxiety. But this morning, he wasn't thinking about being. He was thinking about becoming. I need to achieve something now. I really need to achieve something monumental, a happening of such vast importance that people will know who I am, not who they think I am. And if he had reflected for a moment on the word people, he might have seen the task very differently. But he was young. Wizards and people are very similar in so many ways. Once they have something, they want something else. And you cannot really be free until you want nothing at all. He knew how to turn stones into gold. He even knew how to be invisible, which is really about becoming something very, very small. But it wasn't enough. So sitting there with his feet up on the balcony, watching the sun turn from silver to yellow, he made a vow. I will not sleep, not until I have dreamed the dream, and not until the dream is a reality and the reality is felt by the entire earth. His eyes leaning into the distance out over the sea. Abraxus sat there for a week, considering all the great achievements of wizards past, how Gandalf had survived the fall into the endless chasm, how Einstein had uncovered eternity, and Merlin had calmed all England. He concluded that these were paltry acts. Eventually they would all be forgotten. He wanted something much, much bigger. The weeks passed, and true to his word, he did not sleep. Occasionally he would pace up and down the marble hallway, but mostly he sat there, just leering into the endless blue sky in a shadowy veil on the balcony. By now he had grown tired of human beings, the endless cycle of being born, of dying, of droughts and rains. These were of no concern of his. And after 263 years, he had seen shining beauty transformed into old age too many times. He wasn't touched anymore by the sum of life. It was just life. It began and it ended. And whether the purpose was the point or the point was the purpose was of no interest to him anymore. And some time ago he had concluded human beings exist in a perpetual state of being lost, of not knowing where they are and what they are. And because of this, they imagined certainties and surrounded themselves with histories, neither of which ever existed, not physically, not definitely, and definitely not forever. He had learned that forever was nothing to do with the future. Forever is now. What he most admired about human beings was how much importance they placed on the state of love and their capacity for tenderness. Once, about 286 years ago, Abraxus had had a party. It was before he had learnt to inhabit different states of beings, before he had learnt that to desire was something you could choose, rather than something that simply happened to you. He was particularly smitten with Imelisa Verdi at the time and had arranged for his palace to be decked with roses and sweet peas. And the next morning he sent the birds down into Seneca to sing at her window. Seneca was just a small fishing village. It was where Abraxus had grown up. He knew the streets and the smells. Of course, everything had changed since he was a child. He was a changeling baby, and normally they were drowned. But as luck would have it, he resembled so closely the human baby whose place he had taken that no one realized, including himself, really who he was. It wasn't until his powers began to arrive in his later teenage years that he was shunned and feared, cast out into the hills, his mother weeping that he should not be harmed. Anyway, he wasn't part of that anymore. Abraxus sat on the balcony for nearly 9 weeks. And over that time, he began to realize he was the sum of all that he had chosen to experience. He contained elements and feelings of all he had become. He was the fragment of floating dust, the moth locking onto the lamp, the frenzy, the release. He knew how to become, that it was a combination of imagination and meditation until he found the door, the right vibration. And he had started the process by imagining what the cat saw through her eyes, her world. Once he could see all that she saw, it was the smallest and simplest of steps to exchange states, to become the cat. He had become very good at it. He could do it very quickly now. He could do it in what appeared to be an instant. He could become anything at all. There are a few states that are impossible to penetrate completely. He struggled with birds. He could charm them, but never fully realize their being. Birds belonged to the wind, and she guarded them jealously. It was relatively easy to bring water from the ground, but once he had brought forth a spring, he couldn't stop it. He could not undo what he had done. Very occasionally, in summer, in Ultima, there was a violent storm. It was late evening and the sea was showing signs of restlessness. As night approached, Abraxus could hear the men shouting to one another as they frantically pulled their fishing boats higher and higher up the beach, which stretched out in front of Seneca. And by morning, the waves had arrived. Then just before lunch, for about 3 minutes, everything went very still. And far out into the distance, this black, sparkling hem, flashing lightning and murmuring thunder appeared. Abraxus loved the storms, mainly because they didn't happen very often, and he became agitated, almost nervous. At about 5 o'clock, the wind arrived with such a force that it set the church bells going in the village, ringing out a pandemonium, the rain now battering the earth. Abraxas stood there, holding onto the edge of the balcony, shouting with each gust, "Storm! Storm!" And in the brief lulls, he relaxed, and he was breathing heavily, only to rage again with the arrival of the next violent swathe. "Storm! Storm!" And Abraxas jumped up onto the edge of the balcony, his arms outstretched, holding onto the roof tiles above him, water running down his face, his breathing irregular, his eyes incensed. "Yes, yes, yes," he screamed. "You shall be mine." He fell back violently, crashing through a blue and green stained glass window behind him, and there he stayed on his back in all that noise, his eyes slowly shutting, a small pulse of purple blood coming from just beneath his hairline, dissolving as the rain hit his now sleeping face. He lay there for 2 days and 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, the sun arrived to reclaim the white walls of Seneca. The men gathered on the beach to check their boats, the women greeting each other with exaggerated tales of torrents and valor. People talked. It had, of course, been the worst storm in the history of Ultima. No one had seen anything like it. No, not even the old men could remember anything so fierce, and nothing was ever likely to be as ferocious again. As the shank of light began to move over Abraxas's face, he opened his eyes, his body still motionless, and then a faint smile loosened his dry lips. He stood up slowly, almost painfully, eventually standing and stretching loudly, his bones crackling. He took a glass of water from a nearby jar and sipped, his eyes fixed on the reality of the dreadful dream, to capture the wind. Inside, he made himself a cup of lotus flower tea and sat on his haunches at the end of the marbled corridor. It was indeed a monumental undertaking. To his knowledge, no one had ever challenged the wind. Her domain was unchecked, her spirit unbounded. Her only failing, if she had one at all, was that she was very, very vain. Her invisibility to others only served to convince her of her own overwhelming beauty. And it is true that if any man ever laid eyes on her, they would eventually go mad, haunted by desire. It was her fervour that sculptured deserts, and her tension that brought the waves in from the sea. But it was the great storms, with all their anger and passion, that actually portrayed her fragile vanity. Abraxas stood up and looked out into the distance. "A challenge," he shouted. "This feeble wind can do more than break boats. Where is this paltry mistress of the air?" He placed his raven cloak over his shoulders, took an umbrella, and walked out of the back door, heading down the mountain towards the white walls of Seneca, a black umbrella bobbing above him. The mountain path ended on the beach, and 1/2 mile further on was the village of Seneca. And from the distance, the children and the fishermen became aware of this tall, dark figure pacing towards them. Everyone stopped. The men half pretending to be busy as Abraxas came closer. He walked straight through them without acknowledging anyone, jumping onto the jetty, followed by a ragtag of children. In the village, the women stood on doorsteps, and the dogs ran. In the middle of Seneca was a small bar, and there were a few elderly men sitting outside, leaning on walking sticks, and there was a woman inside washing some fish in a bowl. Abraxas went inside because it was cooler in there, and Seneca, being lower down, didn't have the light breeze of the mountain. A woman and a child were sitting at a table just where the sun broke through a crack in the roof. They immediately stopped talking, and the woman lifted the child onto her lap. Abraxas sat at the corner table and placed both hands over his umbrella. Pepe, he yelled. The young man emerged from behind a tasseled doorway. I must speak with Pepe, Giorgio. The young man nervously held the tray in his hands. My grandfather is dead. And you are his grandson. You know who I am. I must apologize. I had no idea he even had a son. I had no idea it had been so long. The old men filed in from outside and sat at a table next to the woman. Abraxus glanced at them, bowing his head very slightly. Your grandfather and I used to talk, he said. I need your help. You know you will be well paid for it.